It all started on November 10th. Mia Thompson had just moved into her new neighborhood a few weeks earlier, and she was determined to make a fresh start for herself and her son, Tommy. The boxes were mostly unpacked, the curtains finally hung, and for the first time in a long while, things felt almost normal. Tommy had been excited about his upcoming birthday, and Mia, wanting him to feel happy in their new home, decided to throw a clown-themed birthday party. Anything to see him smile again. Mia found the ad for Bingo the Friendly Clown online while searching for party entertainers. The ad looked hastily put together. The picture of Bingo was slightly blurry, and there were more typos than she felt comfortable with. But the price was cheap, and Tommy had been so excited when she told him about the idea. Against her better judgment, she booked Bingo for the big day. On the morning of the party, the house was filled with the chatter of kids, the scent of cake, and the sound of laughter. Everything seemed perfect, except for one detail. Bingo was late. Mia tried to ignore her growing worry, glancing repeatedly at her phone. When Bingo finally arrived, she felt her heart sink a little. He wasn't what she had expected. His suit was stained and wrinkled, the colors faded and mismatched. His makeup looked like it had been applied in a hurry, with smudges giving him a tired, almost sinister expression. "Sorry I'm late," Bingo called out, his voice overly cheerful. Mia forced a smile, trying to mask her unease as she welcomed him in. The kids didn't seem to mind. They rushed towards Bingo, eager for his tricks and jokes. Mia stood back, her arms crossed, watching closely. Something felt off, but she didn't want to make a scene. This was for Tommy, after all. Bingo started his act, and at first it was what she expected. Balloon animals, silly voices, exaggerated pratfalls. But then, his jokes took a strange turn. He made a joke about hiding in closets, then another about watching from windows late at night. Mia's stomach twisted, her eyes narrowing as she watched him. She glanced at the other parents, but they were busy chatting, not paying attention. She wanted to say something, to stop him, but the kids were laughing. Tommy was laughing, and she didn't want to ruin her son's special day. It got worse when Bingo began handing out party favors. Mia watched as he pulled out a bag, reaching in to hand the children small trinkets. But they weren't toys or candy. They were old, tarnished items. Rusty keys, a chipped porcelain doll head, a small, cracked mirror. Mia felt her pulse quicken, and she marched over to him. "Hey, what are you doing?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Bingo looked at her, his painted smile unwavering. He said nothing, simply turned back to the children, ignoring her completely. Mia's heart pounded. Something was very wrong. Suddenly, she noticed. Tommy was gone. Panic washed over her like ice water. She called his name, her voice rising above the chatter. The kids looked at her, confused. She scanned the yard, the living room, the kitchen. No Tommy. She felt her breath quicken, her hands trembling as she searched every room in the house, her calls growing more frantic. And there, at the end of the hallway, was Bingo, standing completely still, his eyes following her every move, a strange calmness in his gaze. He didn't offer to help, didn't move. He just watched. Mia's heart was in her throat as she ran to the bathroom door. She tried the handle, locked. "Tommy?" she called, her voice cracking. She heard a muffled sob from the other side. "Mom?" Tommy's voice was small, scared. "Bingo put me in here. He said it was a joke." Mia's hands shook as she fumbled with the lock, finally getting the door open. Tommy rushed into her arms, his face streaked with tears. She held him tight, her eyes blazing as she turned back towards the hallway. "You need to leave! Now!" Her voice was low, trembling with rage as she glared at Bingo. The clown tilted his head, that painted smile still stretched across his face. "I know where you live now, Mia. I know all about your little move," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but each word cutting into her like a knife. Mia's blood ran cold. She grabbed her phone, her fingers dialing 911 as she backed away, keeping Tommy behind her. Bingo didn't move. He watched her for a moment longer before turning and walking out the door, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The police arrived within minutes, but Bingo was already gone. They searched the neighborhood, but there was no sign of him. One of the officers pulled Mia aside, his expression grave as he explained. Bingo, if that was even his real name, had been involved in multiple break-ins across the area. He used children's parties as a cover, gathering information, learning the layout of homes, finding out who lived there and when they'd be vulnerable. Mia held Tommy close that night, her heart aching with fear and guilt. She had wanted to give her son a happy birthday, a sense of normalcy in their new home. Instead, she had let a monster into their lives. And as she locked every door and window, double-checking each one, she knew things would never feel normal again. Story 2. Ethan Moore adjusted his rearview mirror, his eyes flitting over the near-empty roads. It was late. The kind of late where you question if the shadows are moving or if it's just your imagination. He tapped the steering wheel nervously, the delivery order lying on the passenger seat beside him. Tonight's cargo, several clown costumes and face paint. The request came in last minute, tagged as urgent, and his manager didn't give him a choice. Remote warehouse, not the best part of town. It all felt off. Ethan wasn't one to trust anyone easily, not after what happened last time. He still bore the scars of betrayal from the close friend who gutted his belief in people. And now, with Ben Harper, his laid-back, always joking co-worker, tagged to help him unload, his instinct was screaming that something wasn't right. As he pulled out of the depot, Ethan's gut tightened. Something about the night seemed different, heavy, ominous. The rattling of his old delivery truck did nothing to calm his nerves, and he glanced at the address again. The warehouse was far, remote, where the streetlights started thinning out. He gripped the wheel tightly, watching as the city lights disappeared in his side mirrors. It wasn't until he hit the highway that he noticed it. An old, beaten-up white van with no plates. It lurked in his rear view, never too close but never far enough to lose. It stayed with him through the turns, matching his pace like a ghost. He couldn't shake it, paranoia inching up his spine with each mile. He didn't dare speed up, not wanting to provoke whoever was behind the wheel. Finally, after what felt like hours, Ethan reached the warehouse. The building loomed in front of him, a hulking shadow against the night sky. He could make out a single dim light above the loading dock, flickering in a lazy rhythm. He turned off the engine and took a deep breath, the silence almost deafening. He scanned the area, no sign of the van now, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave him. As he climbed out of the truck, his heart skipped a beat. Ben was already there. "Hey man, took you long enough," Ben called out, waving casually from the dock. Ethan frowned, his distrust bubbling up like bile. How the hell did Ben get here before him? They were supposed to leave the depot at the same time. Something about the easy grin on Ben's face made Ethan's skin crawl. He forced a smile, nodding, but kept his distance. "Yeah, traffic was weird," Ethan mumbled, his eyes darting around the warehouse lot. He noticed it then, movement in the shadows, a shuffling sound that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. Before he could react, they appeared, a group of men, stepping out of the dark, dressed in full clown gear, their faces painted in grotesque grins, their footsteps eerily silent. Ethan's pulse skyrocketed as they encircled him, their eyes hidden behind the paint, but their intent crystal clear. What is this?" Ethan stammered, backing up against the truck. Ben's smile was gone, replaced by something else, fear. He stepped forward, hands raised in a half-hearted attempt at calming the clowns. Hey, take it easy, all right? He's not part of this. He doesn't know anything." One of the clowns, taller than the rest, with a gaudy red wig and smeared lipstick, stepped up to Ben, shoving him back. "You brought a liability," the clown hissed, his voice distorted under the mask. "You said he'd be clueless. Now we got a problem." Ethan's head spun as they grabbed him, rough hands binding his wrists behind his back. He struggled, but the clowns were strong, their grips iron tight. He looked at Ben, his eyes wide, pleading. Ben wouldn't meet his gaze. "You used me?" Ethan managed, his voice cracking. Ben swallowed hard, his face pale. I didn't know they were going to do this, man. I swear." The clowns ignored their exchange, pushing both men towards the warehouse door. Inside, the air was damp, reeking of mold and decay. The clowns worked in silence, tying Ethan and Ben to two metal support beams. Ethan's mind raced, his body trembling as the realization of the situation set in. "Listen," Ben tried again, his voice desperate now. "Let him go, all right? I'll take the blame. Just let him go." The clown with the red wig laughed, a hollow, empty sound that echoed in the dark space. He leaned in close to Ben, his painted smile inches from Ben's face. "You think we care about blame? You're both liabilities now." Ethan's eyes widened as he watched one of the clowns pull out a canister of gasoline, the pungent smell filling the air as they splashed it across the floor. Panic surged through him, his heart pounding in his ears. He pulled at his restraints, the ropes biting into his skin, but it was no use. "Please," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible over the rush of blood in his ears. The clowns said nothing, their painted faces betraying no emotion. One of them struck a match, the tiny flame flickering before being tossed to the ground. The fire caught instantly, flames spreading across the gasoline-soaked floor, licking at the walls of the warehouse. Ethan turned to Ben, their eyes locking for a brief moment. Ben's face was a mask of regret, his mouth opening as if to say something, an apology maybe, or a final plea. But the roar of the fire swallowed his words, the heat intensifying as the flames grew higher. Ethan closed his eyes, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them bringing any comfort. His suspicion about Ben had been right all along, but in the end it didn't matter. The truth offered no solace, no escape, just the crackling of flames and the suffocating heat of betrayal. Story 3. It all happened on October 25th. The night was crisp, the kind where the chill seeped into your bones. Daisy Cooper tugged her coat tighter around her shoulders as she stood at the deserted bus stop. The street was quiet, too quiet, and the dull hum of the streetlight above her head did nothing to ease the anxiety bubbling inside. The bus schedule showed no more arrivals that night, and her phone's battery was already in the red. She sighed, her breath clouding in the cold air. Daisy hated this, hated being in situations that weren't planned, unfamiliar. After a few minutes of restless pacing, she pulled up the ride-hailing app. Nothing. It seemed every available driver had vanished into the night. That's when she saw it, an old taxi idling across the street, with a clown sticker slapped crookedly on the rear door. Desperation tugged at her, and Daisy hesitated. Her instinct told her no, but she was cold, tired, and just wanted to get home. She reluctantly waved, and the car pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, and a man with a wide grin looked out. "Need a lift? Name's Smiley. Hop in." His voice was unnervingly cheerful, as if it was rehearsed, and Daisy hesitated before finally pulling the door open and sliding in. The smell of cheap air freshener filled her nostrils, a sickly, sweet scent that seemed to cover something else, something metallic. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice almost drowned by the hum of the engine. Smiley wore a brightly colored baseball cap, and dangling from his rearview mirror was a clown mask, its painted grin twisted and garish. Daisy looked away, forcing herself to focus on the view outside. The city lights flickered by, and she tried to steady her breathing, counting each passing lamppost in her head. "Long night, huh?" Smiley broke the silence, his voice overly friendly. Daisy nodded, not really wanting to engage. He continued asking questions about her job, her plans for the weekend, anything to keep her talking. It felt forced, like he was reading from a script. She gave short answers, her eyes flicking nervously to the GPS on her phone. Her gut twisted when she noticed they were off course. I think you missed the turn," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Nah, don't worry," Smiley replied, his grin unwavering. "This is a shortcut. We'll get you home quicker." Daisy glanced at her GPS again, the little dot moving further and further from the familiar route. Her pulse quickened, and her fingers tightened around her phone. She stole a glance at the passenger seat and felt her stomach drop. There, next to an old fast food bag, were gloves. Thick, heavy-duty gloves, stained with something dark. blood. Daisy's breath caught in her throat and she tried to swallow her fear, her mind racing. She had to stay calm. She had to think. "Can you let me out here? I think I'll just walk," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Smiley didn't respond. His grin seemed to widen as he stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the wheel. Panic clawed at her chest, and she opened her phone, her fingers shaking as she sent her live location to her friend, the last contact she had messaged. She prayed silently, her heart hammering in her ears. The taxi slowed, but not to let her out. They were pulling into an old, abandoned gas station. The windows were boarded up, and the sign creaked in the wind. Daisy's breath quickened, her eyes darting around, searching for a way out. That's when she saw them, two figures stepping out from behind the building, both dressed in full clown costumes, their faces hidden behind painted masks. One held a shovel, the other a crowbar. Daisy's instincts kicked in. She fumbled for the door handle, her fingers slipping in her panic. She managed to shove the door open, stumbling out onto the cracked pavement. She could hear Smiley's voice, his tone no longer cheerful, but harsh, commanding. "Get her!" Daisy ran, her legs pumping as she sprinted towards the convenience store attached to the gas station. She slammed into the door, her hands scrabbling for the lock. The clowns were close now, their footsteps echoing in the empty lot. She managed to lock the door just as they reached it, their masked faces pressing against the glass, their eyes cold and calculating. She backed away, her entire body trembling, her eyes darting around the dark store. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The clowns began pounding on the glass, the sound echoing through the empty space. Daisy could feel the tears welling in her eyes, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. And then, sirens. The distant wail of police sirens cut through the night, growing louder, closer. The clowns turned, their heads snapping towards the sound. They exchanged a glance before bolting, disappearing into the shadows just as quickly as they had appeared. Daisy sank to the floor, her back against the counter, her entire body shaking. The police arrived moments later, their lights flashing, their voices echoing as they called out to her. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. She could only watch as they searched the area, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They found no trace of Smiley or the other clowns. It was as if they had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the echo of their laughter and the memory of their painted faces. Daisy knew she would never forget that night. The night she came face to face with her worst fears and realized that sometimes the monsters were real. Story 4. It all began on October 15th. Kyle Benson, a 19-year-old college dropout, was restless. Life had been a series of odd jobs and sleepless nights, trying to find some semblance of purpose. When Marcus, his old friend from high school, called with an idea, Kyle had hesitated. Marcus had always been the kind of guy who gravitated toward trouble, but they'd been friends once, and Kyle was bored. That's how he found himself standing in front of the old house on Willow Street late that night. The house loomed over them, dark and abandoned, with an air of menace that made Kyle's stomach twist. It was rumored to be the hideout of a local gang, one that wore clown disguises during their break-ins, leaving a trail of fear in their wake. The stories sounded ridiculous, but looking up at the house now, with its shattered windows and graffiti-covered walls, Kyle couldn't help but feel uneasy. Clown faces, crude and unsettling, were painted across the siding, their eyes seeming to follow him as he moved. "Come on, man, don't chicken out," Marcus said, grinning as he nudged Kyle towards the open front door. The door creaked, barely hanging on its hinges, and Kyle swallowed hard, his nerves fraying with each step he took inside. The air was heavy, filled with the scent of mildew and something else. Something rotten. "This place is creepy as hell," Kyle muttered, shining his flashlight across the dilapidated living room. The wallpaper was peeling, and the floor was littered with empty beer cans, old newspapers, and broken furniture. Marcus, on the other hand, seemed unfazed. He moved confidently through the house, his own flashlight casting long shadows across the walls. "They say this is where they plan their hits," Marcus said, his voice echoing slightly. "The clown gang, you know, They scope out the whole neighborhood from here. He sounded almost excited, like this was some kind of adventure. Kyle didn't share his enthusiasm. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, but Marcus was already moving further in, and Kyle wasn't about to stay behind by himself. They moved through the narrow hallways, the floors creaking under their weight. They found strange items scattered around, discarded clown wigs, torn costumes, and photographs of neighborhood homes. Kyle picked up one of the photos, his breath catching in his throat. It was his street, his house, taken from a distance. He could see his mom's car parked in the driveway. "Marcus, we need to go," Kyle said, his voice tight with panic. He turned to find Marcus, but his friend was already heading up the stairs, the old wood groaning under his steps. "Come on, Kyle, don't be a baby. Let's check out upstairs," Marcus called down, his voice echoing in the empty space. Kyle's legs felt like lead, his heart pounding as he reluctantly followed. They reached the top of the stairs, finding a narrow hallway that led to a door at the end. Marcus pushed it open, revealing a room filled with old televisions. Each screen flickered with grainy black and white footage, live feeds of neighborhood streets, front doors, and driveways. Kyle's stomach dropped as he recognized the streets, the houses. They were watching the entire neighborhood. "What the hell is this?" Kyle whispered, fear clawing at his chest. Marcus didn't answer. He was staring at the screens, his face pale, his mouth slightly open. Then, without warning, the power cut off. The room plunged into darkness, the hum of the TVs replaced by an eerie silence. "Marcus?" Kyle called out, his voice trembling. He fumbled with his flashlight, the beam flickering as he turned it on. The light cut through the darkness, revealing Marcus, his eyes wide with fear. And then Kyle heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway behind them. Marcus screamed, a sound that sent ice through Kyle's veins. He swung his flashlight around, the beam catching the glint of something metallic, a knife. The clowns were there, their faces hidden behind grotesque masks, their bodies looming in the shadows. Kyle didn't think. He turned and ran, his feet pounding down the stairs, the walls seeming to close in around him. He burst through the front door, the cold night air hitting him like a slap. He ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes darting around wildly. He could see movement, more clowns, stepping out from the shadows of nearby houses. They were everywhere, watching, waiting. Kyle's legs burned, his lungs screaming for air as he ran down the street, his only thought to get as far away as possible. He didn't stop until he reached the police station, his hands shaking as he pushed open the door. He stumbled inside, gasping out his story to the officers at the desk. They exchanged glances, their expressions grim. One of them, an older man with tired eyes, sighed. "We know about them," he said, his voice low. "We've been trying to catch them, but they always slip away. There's not much we can do." Kyle felt his stomach drop, a hollow emptiness settling in his chest. He had made it out, but Marcus was still back there, and the police, those who were supposed to protect them, seemed powerless. He sank into the chair, his hands still trembling, a sense of hopelessness washing over him. The clowns were still out there, and Marcus was in their hands, and Kyle knew deep down that things would never be the same again.